Hello, friends. Continuing with the next story from the classic fairy tales by Iona and Peter Opie. The next tale is called The Yellow Dwarf. Here's some history. Le Nain Jaune was incorporated in the story of Don Fernand de Tolède in Madame d'Aulnoy's Conte Nouveau ou les Fées à la Mode, Volume 6, or Volume 4, 1698, which was translated into English by several hands in A Collection of Novels and Tales, written by that celebrated wit of France, the Countess d'Aulnoy. In the story, the Countess shows her skill at embodying features and motives of traditional fairy lore in a tale that is original and in maintaining interest in the well-being of the principal characters despite virtually the entire action being magical. Only the beginning of the tale is worldly, where a beautiful princess, overindulged by her mother, is indifferent to the 20 kings who have come to court her, a frigidity which makes her mother fear she will become an old maid, she being already 15, an age when princesses, both in the real world at this time and in fairy tale, were expected to be giving matrimony their serious consideration. Thereafter, Madame d'Aulnoy introduced rapid journeys through the air, evil people who are ugly but who have the unfair ability to appear beautiful, a sword of invincibility, an engagement ring made of a single red hair being a fairy characteristic, which it is impossible to remove, and cakes made to pacify guardian lions on the way to the desert fairy, such as Psyche had to take to pacify Cerberus when she arrived at Proserpine's dark palace. How closely Madame d'Aulnoy was attuned to fairy tradition may be seen by comparing the first book, completed 1589, of Spenser's Fairy Queen, in which Duessa, the false sorceress, daughter of deceit and shame, and of Archimago, the wicked magician, beguiled the Red Cross Knight with her forged beauty and led him away from truth, and how Duessa conveyed the knight to the Palace of Pride, which, like the desert fairy's stately palace, was filled with multitudes of beautiful people. Quote, "A noble crew of lords and ladies stood on every side, which with their presence fair the place much beautified." There we go. Spelled funny. Duessa, in her normal state, was a filthy, foul old woman with neither parts misshapen monstrous. It is the nether parts, especially the feet, which fairies find impossible to transform as they can the rest of their bodies. Thus the desert fairy is able to change her appearance so completely that at first the young king of the gold mines believes he is in the presence of a lovely nymph, but her griffin feet betray her. Even the devil himself cannot disguise his cloven hoofs, and Solomon, when warned that the Queen of Sheba was really a jinn, was instructed that he could ascertain this by inspecting her legs, which would be like an ass's legs, covered with coarse hair. Despite its unhappy ending, tale of the Yellow Dwarf has been one of the most popular of Madame d'Aulnoy's stories, particularly as a pantomime. Mother Bunch and the Yellow Dwarf was performed at Astley's Royal Amphitheatre in 1807. The Yellow Dwarf, or Harlequin King of the Gold Mines, was performed at Sadler's Wells in 1820. The Yellow Dwarf, or Harlequin Knight of the Lion, was presented at Vauxhall Gardens in 1829, and at the end of the century one of the places where the Yellow Dwarf was performed was on the West Pier at Brighton in 1899. However, the tale was not always to end unhappily. When Walter Crane illustrated the story in 1875, the dwarf duly suffered the fate the wicked should expect in a fairy tale. He darted forward to seize the magic sword, but the princess uttered a loud shriek, and the king turned round in time to snatch the sword from the ground. Quote, "With one blow he slew the wicked dwarf, and then conducted the princess to the seashore, where the friendly siren was waiting to convey them to the queen. On their arrival at the palace, the wedding took place, and Toute Belle, cured of her vanity, lived happily with the king of the gold mines. End quote. All right, the story. Pardon. The Yellow Dwarf. There was a queen who, though she had many children, could get but one to live, which was a beautiful daughter, and being left a widow, and without hopes of having any more, was so much afraid of losing her. But she never gave her any correction for what faults she committed, insomuch that admirable person, who knew her own beauty, and that she was born to a crown, was so vain and proud of her growing charms that she despised all the world besides. The queen her mother contributed, by her caresses and complaisance, to persuade her none were deserving of her. She was dressed every day either like a Pallas or a Diana, followed by her nymphs. And in short, the queen, to give the finishing stroke to her vanity, called her all fair. And having had her picture drawn by the best painters, sent it to all the kings with whom she was in alliance, who, when they saw it, were not able to resist the inevitable power of her charms. Some fell sick, others run mad, and those who escaped either sickness or madness came to her court, and as soon as they saw her, became her slaves. Never was any court more gallant and polite. 20 kings studied to please her, who, after they had spent immense sums upon an entertainment upon her, thought themselves fully recompensed if she said anything was pretty in them. The adorations that were paid her overjoyed the queen her mother. Not a day passed over her head, but she had thousands of songs and fine copies of verses sent by all the most famous poets in the world. In short, all fair was the only subject of the most renowned authors, both in prose and verse. The princess was about 15. There were none who did not desire to marry her, but they durst not pretend to that honour. It was so difficult a task to touch an art of that stamp. Her lovers murmured very much against her cruelty, and the queen who wanted to have her married knew not how to gain her consent. Sometimes she would say to her, "Will you not abate somewhat of that intolerable pride that makes you condemn all the kings that come to our court? I will choose one for you, shew me in this some complacency." "I am already happy," replied All Fair and the Easy. "Indifference I now live in. If I should once lose that, you would perhaps be angry." "I should be angry if you loved anyone beneath you," answered the queen. "But you cannot have more deserving princes than those that now ask you." In short, the princess was so prepossessed by of her own merit that she thought it greater than what it was, and by the resolution of hers to live a maid, began to grieve her mother so much that she repented, but too late, that she had humoured her so much. The queen, uncertain what to do, goes all alone to find a celebrated fairy. That was called the Desert Fairy. But as it was an hard thing to see her, because she was guarded by 2 lions, unless she made a cake for them of millet, sugar candy, and crocodile's eggs, she prepared one herself, and put it into a little basket, which she hung upon her arm. But, being wearied with walking farther than she was used to, she laid herself down under the shade of a tree to rest herself, and there insensibly fell asleep, and when she wakened, found only her basket, and her cake gone, and to complete her misfortune, heard the lions coming. "Alas!" cried she, "what will become of me? I shall be devoured." And having no power to stir, she leaned against the tree she had slept under, when hearing somebody say, "Hem, hem," she looked about on all sides, and raising her eyes, perceived a little man in the tree, about a half yard in height, eating oranges, who said to her, "O queen, I know you, and the fear you are in lest these lions should devour you. I cannot blame you. They have devoured a great many, and to your misfortune you want a cake." "I must resolve on death," replied the queen, sighing, "but alas, I should not be so much grieved was my dear girl but married." "What? Have you a daughter?" said the Yellow Dwarf, who was called so from his complexion and the orange tree he lived in. "Indeed, I am very glad of that, for I have sought after a wife both by sea and land. Now, if you will promise me I shall have her, I will secure you both from lions, tigers, and bears." The queen looked at him, as much frightened at his horrible little figure as the lions, and musing some time, returned no answer. "What do you hesitate, madam?" cried he. "It seems you are not very fond of life." At the same time the lions appeared on the top of a small hill, running towards her, at which sight the queen, who trembled like a dove when she sees a kite, cried out with all her might, "Good Sir Dwarf, all fair is yours." "Oh," said he with an air of disdain, "all fair is too fair. I will not have her." "Oh, sir," continued the afflicted queen, "don't refuse her. She is the most charming princess in the world." "Well," said he, "I will take her out of charity, but remember the gift you make me." And thereupon the orange tree opened, and the queen was let into it, and so escaped from the lions. She was so vexed she could find no door to that tree, when at last she perceived one that opened into a field full of nettles and thistles, surrounded with a muddy ditch. In the middle thereof stood a little thatched house, out of which the yellow dwarf came in pleasant air, wooden shoes, a coarse yellow stuff jacket, and without any hair to hide his large ears. "I am glad, good mother-in-law," said he to the queen, "to see you in this my abode, where your daughter is to live with me. She may keep an ass to ride out on with those nettles and thistles, and may secure herself from the injuries of the weather under this rustic roof. She will have this water to drink, and may eat some of these frogs that are fattened in it. Besides, I shall always bear her company, and shall never leave her." When the unfortunate queen came to consider on the deplorable life this dwarf promised her dear child, she was not able to support the terrible idea, but fell into a swoon, and had not the power to say one word, and while she was in that condition, was conveyed to her own bed, in a fine suit of night clothes of the newest fashion. As soon as the queen came to herself, she remembered what had happened, but knew not of how to believe it, seeing she was in her own palace, in the midst of all the ladies of her court, and her daughter by her bedside. But the fine night clothes, which were of a curious lace, amazed her as much as the dream she fancied she'd had, and through the excess of her disquiet she fell into such an extraordinary fit of melancholy, that she hardly either spoke, eat, or slept. The princess, who loved her at heart, was much grieved, and often asked her what was the matter, when the queen, to deceive her, told her sometimes it was proceeded from her ill state of health, and other times from some of the neighbouring princes' threatenings to make war against her. Though All Fair found these answers very plausible, however, she knew there was something more in the bottom, which the queen endeavoured to hide from her, and being no longer able to endure her uneasiness, resolved to go to the desert fairy, to ask her advice whether or no she should marry, since she was so much pressed to it. She took care to make a cake to appease the lions, and pretending to go to bed earlier than ordinary, went down a pair of back stairs in a white veil that reached to her feet, to set forward on her journey. When the princess came to the fatal orange tree, she saw it so loaded with fruit that she had a great mind to gather some, whereupon she set down her basket, and plucked some and eat them. But when she went to look for her basket and cake, and found them taken away, her grief was inexpressible, and turning about, espied the little rightful dwarf, who said to her, "What makes you cry, child?" "Alas, who can forbear?" replied she. "I have lost my basket and cake, which were so necessary in my journey to the desert fairies." "What want you with her?" answered this little monkey. "I am her relation and friend, and I am as knowing to the full." "The queen, my mother," replied the princess, "is grown very melancholy, which makes me fear for her life. I fancy I may be the cause of it, since she has desired me to marry, and I must own to you, I have not yet found any one that I think deserving enough for me. These are reasons that have engaged me to speak with the fairy." "Princess, give yourself no further trouble," said the dwarf. "I am more proper to inform you about these things. The queen, your mother, is vexed that she has promised you in marriage." "The queen promised me in marriage?" said she, interrupting him. "Undoubtedly you are mistaken. She would certainly have told me of it. I am too much concerned in that affair to be engaged without my own consent." "Beautiful princess," said the dwarf, throwing himself at her feet, "I flatter myself this choice will not be displeasing to you when I tell you I am destined to that happiness." "My mother chose you for a son-in-law," cried All Fair, falling back some steps. "Was ever any folly like yours?" "I am not very fond of the honor," said he in a passion, "but here are the lions who will revenge my affront." At the same time the princess heard the lions roaring. "What will become of me?" said she. "Must I thus end my days?" The wicked dwarf looked at her, and with a malicious smile said, "You shall have the glory of dying, and not bestowing your shining merit on a poor miserable dwarf such as I am." "Pray be not angry," said the princess, lifting up her hands. "I'd rather marry all the dwarfs in the world than die after so frightful a manner." "Observe me well, princess," said he, "before you give me your word, for I do not pretend to surprise you." I have already, replied she, "but the lions approach me towards me. Save me, or I shall die with fear." In short, she fell into a swoon, and without knowing how she got there, found herself in her own bed, in the finest linens and ribbons possible, with a ring of one single red hair fast upon her finger, so that she would not get it off. When the princess saw all this, and remembered what had passed before, she grew so melancholy, that all the court were surprised and uneasy at it. The queen was most alarmed of all, and asked 1,000 times what was the matter, but she was determined in herself to conceal her adventure from her. At last the states of the kingdom, impatient to have their princess married, assembled and addressed the queen to make choice of a husband for her out of hand. The queen told them it was what she had most at heart, but that her daughter was very much against it. However, she advised them to go to her and talk with her about it, which they did immediately. All Fair, whose pride was somewhat abated since her adventure with the yellow dwarf, thought it would be best way to marry some potent prince, with whom that little ape would not dare to dispute so glorious a conquest, and gave them a favourable answer, and consented to marry the king of the golden mines, who is a powerful and handsome prince, who loved her with a violent passion, and who never till then durst entertain any hopes. We may easily guess at the excess of his joy, and his rival's rage, when the news was declared. There were great preparations made against the nuptials, and the king of the gold mines launched out such prodigious sums of money that the sea was full of ships, that they were sent to the remotest parts for the greatest rarities. In short, that prince discovered such lively and delicate sentiments that she began to have some passion for him. Thus were they both happy, when one day the king, who was both gallant and in love, took the liberty to discover his tenderness to her in the garden, in verses of his own making, among which he repeated these lines: "The verdant leaves bud out when you appear, and all the trees their brightest liveries wear. The flowers spring forth by your indulgent heat, and amorous birds their little songs repeat. In this blessed place, distant from care and crowns, all nature smiles, and you her goddess owns." In the midst of all this joy, the king's rivals, who were in the utmost despair at his good fortune, and sensible of the most piercing grief, left the court, and returned to their own dominions, not being able to eye witnesses to the prince's marriage. But before they went, they took their leaves of her in so obliging a manner that she could not but pity them. "Oh, madam," said the king of the gold mines, "what do you rob me of by granting your pity to lovers who are over and above recompensed for their pains by one single look from you?" "I should be angry," replied the princess, "if you were insensible of the compassion I have shewn these princes, to whom I am lost for ever. It is a proof of your delicacy, which I approve of. But, sir, their conditions are far different from yours. You ought to be pleased with what I have done for you. They have no reason to be so, therefore you should restrain your jealousy." The king of the gold mines was so confounded at the obliging manner that the princess took a thing that might very well have displeased her, that he threw himself at her feet, kissed her hand, and asked 1,000 pardons. At last the long-wished-for day came, and the nuptials were proclaimed by sounding of trumpets, and all other ceremonies. The balconies were all adorned with tapestries, and the houses bedecked with flowers. The queen was so overjoyed that she was hardly in bed, and got to sleep But she rose again to give the necessary orders, and to choose out the jewels the princess was to wear that day. She was covered almost with diamonds, and on her gown, which was a silver brocade, were 12 suns formed with diamonds. But nothing appeared so bright as that princess's natural charms. A rich crown was set upon her head. Her hair hung down almost to her feet, and the majesty of her shape distinguished her from all the ladies that attended on her. The king of the gold mines shewed himself no less accomplished and magnificent. Joy and cheerfulness appeared in all his actions. None approached him, but he loaded them with his gifts and presents, for he had ordered some thousands of tons of gold, and velvet sacks, embroidered with pearls, full of guineas, to be placed in the hall, and where all that put forth their hands received handfuls of gold, insomuch that this part of the ceremony grew there great crowds of people, that would have been insensible of all the other pleasures. As the king, queen, and princess were going out into a long gallery, they saw a box move towards them, in which there sat a large old woman, at whose age and decrepitness they were not so much surprised as at her ugliness. She leaned upon a crutch, had a black taffety ruff on, a red velvet hood, and a farding tail all in rags, and after taking 2 or 3 turns about, without speaking a word, she stopped in the middle of the gallery, and shaking her crutch in a threatening manner, cried out, "Ho, ho, you queen and princess! Do you think to falsify unpunished your words, which you gave my friend the yellow dwarf? I am the desert fairy, and don't you know that if it had not been for him and his orange tree, you had been devoured by my lions? These insults to fairies shall not be allowed. Think presently on what you design, for I swear by my coif, you shall marry him, or I will burn my crutch." "Ah, princess," said the queen in tears, "what is it that I hear? What have you promised?" "Ah, mother," replied the princess, full of grief, "what have you promised?" The king of the gold mines, enraged at what had passed, and that this wicked old woman should come to oppose his happiness, drew his sword, and going up towards her, pointed it to her throat. "Wretch," said he, "begone from hence, or I'll revenge thy malice on thy life." He had no sooner pronounced these words, but the upper part of the box flew off, and with great noise, out came the yellow dwarf, mounted on a large Spanish cat, and placed himself between the desert fairy and the king of the gold mines. "Rash youth," said he, "think not to commit this violence on the illustrious fairy. Thy rage should light on me. I am thy rival and thy enemy. The false princess, who is going to bestow herself on thee, has given me her word and received mine. See if she has not a ring of my hair upon her finger. By that you may judge of my right to her." "Hideous monster," said the king, "hast thou the boldness to call thyself an adorer of this divine princess, and to pretend to so glorious a possession? Thou art a baboon, such an odious figure that I had sacrificed thee before now, hadst thou been worthy for so honourable a death." The dwarf piqued to the very soul at those words, clapped his spurs in the cat's sides, which made such a mewing and flying about, as frightened all but the king, who hemmed in the dwarf so close that he drew a large cutlass, with which he was armed, and defying the king to a combat, went down into the court of the palace, making a terrible noise. The enraged king followed him as fast as possible, and when they stood opposite to each other, ready to begin the combat, the sun on a sudden turned as red as blood, and it grew as dark as pitch. It thundered and lightened, and by the flashes of the lightning, the king and all the court, who had got into the balconies, perceived 2 giants vomiting fire on each side of the dwarf, all which was not capable of daunting the magnanimous heart of this young monarch, who shewed a wonderful intrepidity in his looks and actions that encouraged all who were concerned for his safety, and gave the dwarf and his enemies some confusion. But all his courage was not proof against what he saw the princess endure, when the desert fairy, with her head covered with snakes, like Tisiphone, and mounted on a winged griffin, struck her so hard with a lance she carried in her hand that she fell into the queen's arms all over blood. This tender mother, who was touched to the very soul to see her daughter in this condition, made most sad complaints, and for the king, He lost both all his reason and courage, left the combat, and ran to the princess to succor her, or die with her. But the yellow dwarf would not give him time to get to her, but flew on his Spanish cat into the balcony where she was, and took her out of her mother's arms and from all the ladies, and then leaping up upon the top of the palace, disappeared with his prey. The king, confused and motionless, looked on at such an extraordinary adventure with the utmost despair, since it was not in his power to help it, when, to complete his misfortunes, he found a mist before his eyes, and himself lifted up by some extraordinary power of the air. For the wicked fairy, who came to assist the yellow dwarf in taking away the princess, had no sooner set her eyes on the king of the gold mines, but her heart grew sensible of that young prince's merit, and that he might be her prey. She therefore carried him to the bottom of a frightful cavern, and there loaded him with chains fixed to a rock, hoping that the dread of an approaching death might make him forget all fair, and engage him to do as she would have him. As soon as he arrived there, she restored him his sight, and borrowing, by the fairy art, all those charms and graces that nature had denied her, appeared to him like a lovely nymph, that was come that way by chance. "What is this that my eyes behold?" said she. "What have you done, charming prince, that you are kept here?" Whereupon the king, deceived by these false appearances, replied, "Alas, fair nymph, I know not what the infernal fury that brought me hither would have, for though, when she took me away, she deprived me of my sight, and has not since appeared, yet I knew by her voice that she was the desert fairy." "Oh, sir," cried the false nymph, "you are in the hands of a woman, who will never let you go till you marry her. 'Tis what she has done by several heroes. She is the most obstinate woman in the world in these affairs." But while she pretended to bear a share in the king's affliction, he perceived her griffin feet, which was always a mark by which the fairy was known in all her metamorphoses, and which she could not change, and seeming to take no notice of it, but speaking in an air of confidence, said, "Indeed, I have no aversion for the desert fairy, but I cannot bear that she should protect the yellow dwarf, and keep me chained thus like a criminal. What have I done? I love, 'tis true, a charming princess, and had I my liberty, it would engage me in my gratitude to love her." "Do you use sincerity?" said the pretended nymph. "Doubt you of it?" replied the king. "I am a novice in the art of dissembling, and I must own to you, a fairy has much more to flatter my vanity with than a princess. But if I loved her to distraction, and she confined me, I should hate her." Deceived by these words, the desert fairy resolved to transport him to a place as agreeable as this was horrible, and to that end obliged to get him into her chariot, which was then drawn by swans, whereas it was generally drawn by bats. But in what a condition was this prince, when as he was traversing this waste space of air, he saw his dear princess in a castle of polished steel, the walls of which cast such a reflection when the sun shined that there was no going near it. She was laid in a grove by a brookside, leaning her head on one hand and wiping away her tears with the other, and as she was looking up to heaven to ask relief, she saw the king pass along with the desert fairy, who, as she had made use of her art to seem handsome to that young monarch, she appeared to the princess the most charming person in the world. "What," cried she, "am I not unfortunate enough to be in this inaccessible castle, whither this ugly dwarf has brought me, but to add to my misfortunes, I must be tormented with jealousies? Must I be informed by such an extraordinary adventure of the infidelity of the king of the gold mines, who has certainly thought that by losing the sight of me, he was freed from his oaths? But who can this formidable rival be, whose fatal beauty surpasses mine?" While she was saying these words, the amorous king felt a mortal pain in being carried away with such swiftness from the dear object of his vows. Had he not known the fairy's power, he would certainly have tried to have got from her, either by killing her or some other means that his love and courage would have suggested to him. But how could he attempt anything at this time? The fairy also perceived the princess, and sought in the king's eyes to penetrate into the effect that sight might produce in his heart. None can inform you so well as myself of what you want to know," said... Let me start this over. The fairy also perceived the princess, and sought in the king's eyes to penetrate into the effect that sight might produce in his heart. None can inform you so well as myself of what you want to know, said he to her. The unexpected meeting with that unhappy princess, for whom I had once some respect before I was acquainted with your charms, gave me some small disturbance, but you have so much a greater sway over me that I would sooner die than be false to you. Ah, prince, said she, may I flatter myself with having inspired you with such favourable sentiments for me? Time shall convince you, madam, replied he, but if you would make me sensible that I have any part in your esteem, deny not all fair your assistance. Do you know what you asked? Answered the fairy, knitting her brow and frowning. What would you have me make use of my knowledge against the yellow dwarf, who is my best friend, to force a proud princess, whom I must look upon as my rival, out of his hands? No, I cannot bear the thoughts of it. At that the king sighed inwardly, but durst return no answer. At last they came up to a large meadow, enamelled with various flowers, and surrounded by a deep river, into which there ran several small brooks, which formed meanders about little holts of trees, where there was always a fresh air. At a small distance stood a stately palace, the walls of which were of transparent emeralds, and as soon as the swans that drew them alighted, thousands of beautiful persons came to receive the fairy with acclamations of joy, and songs in praise of her and charms in her choice, which overjoyed the fairy to hear them mention her amours. She led the king into the most magnificent apartment that had ever been seen in the memory of fairies, and leaving him there, and thinking she was not sure she had captivated him, she got into an obscure place, from whence she might observe all his actions, and he, fancying she would watch him, went to a large glass, and said to it, Faithful adviser, permit me to study out ways to render myself agreeable to the charming fairy, whom I adore, for great is my desire to please. And thereupon he painted, powdered, and patched, put on a magnificent suit of clothes that lay ready for him, and adjusted himself the best he could. Upon this the fairy went in unto him, so much transported with joy, that she could not moderate it. I shall not forget, said she, the care you have taken to please me. You have found out the true and only way. You see, sir, it is not so difficult when people please. The king, who thought that saying fine things to the fairy was the best card he could play, spared no soft expressions at this juncture, and by that means got leave to take a walk on the seashore, which the fairy by her art and rendered so dangerous and boisterous that no pilots were so bold as to venture to sail in it, so that she was under no apprehensions of her prisoner's escaping, who thought it was a great assuagement to his pains to muse along, and think of his dearest princess, without being interrupted by his hateful gaoler. When he had walked some time, kissed the sand, and invoked the powers of the sea, he heard a voice which made him give great attention, and observing the waves to swell, and regarding them steadfastly, he perceived a beautiful mermaid arise, with a looking-glass in one hand, and combing her hair, which was gently agitated by the winds, with the other. At this sight the king was very much surprised, but much more when it came to him and said, I know the sad condition you are reduced to by your separation from your princess, and the desert fairy's passion for you. If you approve of it, I will carry you away from this fatal place, where perhaps you may languish out 30 or 40 years. The king knew not what to answer the return, nor not but he desired to be delivered from his captivity, but for fear the fairy had assumed a new form to deceive him. And as he hesitated, the siren, who guessed at his thoughts, said, Fear not, this is no snare laid for you. I am too much an enemy to the desert fairy and the yellow dwarf to serve them. I see your unfortunate princess every day. Her beauty and merit raises my pity, and I tell you again, if you have any confidence in me, I will assist you to get away. I have so much in you, cried the king, that I will do whatever you bid me, but since you have seen my princess, tell me some news of her. "We shall lose too much time in talking," replied the siren. "Come along with me, and I will carry you to the steel castle, and leave on this shore a figure so like you, the fairy shall be deceived by it." She presently cut down some sea rushes, and bundling them together, and blowing upon them, said, "My good friends, I order you not to stir off from this beach, till the desert fairy comes and takes you away." Whereupon a skin grew over the rushes, and they became so like the king of the gold mines that it was surprising. They were clothed like the king, looked pale and dead, as if he had been drowned. After this the siren made the king sit upon her fish's tail, and both sailed away in a rolling sea, with all imaginable satisfaction. When they were at some distance from the shore, the siren said, "I will now tell you how the wicked dwarf carried the princess away. He set her behind him on his Spanish cat, and notwithstanding the blood she lost by the wound she received from the desert fairy, which made her swoon away, he never stopped to give her assistance till he had her safe in his steel castle, where he was received by some of the most beautiful persons in the world, which he had transported thither, who all shewed a great desire to serve the princess, who was put into a bed of cloth and gold, embroidered with large pearls." "Oh," cried the king of the gold mines, "he has married her. I swoon and die away." "No," said she, "assure yourself the prince's constancy is too firm to admit of that." "Then go on," replied he. "What I have more to tell you is," continued the siren, "she was in the grove you passed over, and I saw you with the desert fairy, who was so painted that she seemed to her of a much superior beauty to herself, and her despair is not to be comprehended, since she fancies you love her." "I love her!" cried the king. "Just heavens! How much is she deceived? What ought not I to do to make her sensible? How much is she mistaken?" "Consult your own heart," answered the siren with a gracious smile. "People that are deeply engaged have no need of advice on that account." And just as she made an end of these words, they arrived at the steel castle, which on the seaside the dwarf had not fortified with those burning balls. "I know," said the siren, "the princess is by the same brookside where you saw her as you passed by. But as you will have a great many enemies to fight with before you can come to her, take this sword, with which you may undertake anything, and face the greatest dangers, provided you never let it out of your hand. Farewell, I shall retire under that rock you see there. If you have any need of me to conduct you farther with your princess, I shall not fail you, for the queen her mother is my best friend, and 'twas on her account that I have thus served you." After these words she gave him the sword, which was made of one entire diamond, that gave as great a lustre as the sun. Upon receiving it, he could use no words expressive enough for acknowledgment, but desired her to make it up in thinking all that a generous mind was capable of. But to return to the desert fairy, when she saw that her lover did not return, she hastened after to find him, running all along the shore, attended with 100 young damsels, loaded with presents for him. Some brought great baskets full of diamonds, some golden vessels of admirable work, some ambergris, coral, and pearls, and some carried great pieces of stuffs upon their heads, of prodigious richness. Others, flowers, fruits, and birds, in short, everything that might be acceptable. But in what a sad condition was the fairy, when following this noble troop, she saw the rushes in the shape of the king of the gold mines. She was so amazed and grieved that she gave a terrible shriek that made the hills echo again, and seemed more furious than Megara, Electro, and Tisiphone together. She threw herself upon the body, cried, howled, and tore 50 of the persons that were with her in pieces as a sacrifice to the manes of her dear deceased. Then she called 11 of her sister fairies to help her to erect a stately mausoleum to this young hero, who were all as much deceived by herself as by the siren, who was more powerful than they. But while they were providing porphyry, jasper, agate, marble, statues, and devices in gold and brass, to immortalize the memory of the king, whom they thought to be dead. He thanked the lovely siren, conjuring her to grant him protection, which she engaging him she would. He had nothing to do but advance toward the steel castle. Thus, guided by his love, he went forward, and looking carefully about, perceived his adorable princess, but was not long without employment, for 4 terrible sphinxes flew at him, and had torn him into 1,000 pieces, had it not been for the siren's sword, which glittered so in their eyes that they fell down at his feet without any strength, and he gave each a mortal wound, and so proceeded on till he met with 6 dragons, whose scaled skins were harder than iron. Whatever fear such creatures might have put some into, he was intrepid, and with his sword cut them all asunder. And he thought he had surmounted the utmost difficulties, when he met with the greatest of all, which was 24 nymphs, holding in their hands long garlands of flowers, with which they stopped his passage. "Whither are you going, sir?" said they. "We are appointed to guard this palace, and if we let you pass, it will be bad both for you and us. Therefore pray be not obstinate. Sure you would not imbrue your victorious arm in the blood of so many young innocent damsels who have done you no wrong." At these words the king, who was a great admirer of the fair sex, and had professed himself always their protector, was so confounded to think that he must force his passage through them, that he knew not what to resolve on, when he heard a voice say, "Strike, strike, or you will lose your princess forever." Whereupon, without making any reply, he threw himself into the midst of the nymphs, giving them no quarter, and soon dispersed them. This being the last obstacle he had to meet with, he went into the grove, where the princess lay pale and languishing by a brookside, and upon his approaching trembling towards her, she flew from him with as much indignation as if he had been the yellow dwarf. "Condemn me not, madam," said he, "before you hear me. I am neither false nor guilty of what you might imagine, but only an unfortunate wretch that has displeased you with repugnance to himself." "Ah, barbarous man," cried she, "I saw you traversing the air with a beautiful person. Was that against your consent?" "Yes, princess," said he, "it was. The wicked desert fairy, not satisfying with chaining me to a rock, took me with her in her chariot, and conveyed me to a distant part of the world, where I should have languished out my days, without any hope of succour, had it not been for a kind siren that brought me hither. I come, my princess, to deliver you out of the hands of those that detain you here. Refuse not the assistance of the most faithful of lovers." Thereupon he threw himself at her feet, and catching hold of her gown, unfortunately let fall the formidable sword, which the yellow dwarf, who lay hid behind some small shrub, no sooner saw out of the king's hand, but, knowing its power, he ran and seized it. The princess, at the sight of the dwarf, gave a terrible shriek, but all her complaints were served only to exasperate the little monster, who by 2 cabalistic words conjured up 2 huge giants that loaded the king with irons. "I am now," said the dwarf, "master of my rival's fate. However, I will grant him his life and liberty, on condition he consents to my marriage." "No, I will die 1,000 deaths first," cried the amorous king in a rage. "Alas," replied the princess, "the thoughts of that is the most terrible of all." "Nothing shocks me so much," answered the king, "as that you should become a victim of this monster." Then said the princess, "Let us die together." "No, my princess," said the king, "let me have the satisfaction of dying for you." "I'd sooner consent," said she, "to the dwarf's desires." "Oh, cruel princess," interrupted the king, "should you marry him before my face, my life would ever after be odious to me." "No, it shall not be before thy face," replied the dwarf, "for a beloved rival I cannot bear." At those words he stabbed the king to the heart, whose death the princess was not able to survive, but fell on her dear prince's body, and poured out her soul with his. Thus died these 2 illustrious but unfortunate lovers, before the siren could apply any remedy, all her power lying in the fatal sword. The wicked dwarf was better pleased to see his princess void of life than in the arms of another, and the desert fairy, being informed of this adventure, conceived as great an hatred against the memory of the king of the gold mines as love for his person, and destroyed the mausoleum she had erected. And for the kind mermaid, who was grieved at this misfortune, she could obtain no other favour of fate but to change them into 2 palm trees, which, preserving a faithful and lasting passion for each other, caress and unite their branches together. The end. The next story is Sleeping Beauty.